The auctioneer's hammer had not yet fallen when Jacob Sawyer made up his mind, and the woman standing on that dusty platform in her black veil had not yet spoken a single word to him. And still he knew, the way a man knows when a storm is coming before the first cloud appears on the horizon, that something in his life was about to change in a way that could not be undone. It was the spring of 1874, and the town of Harlow Creek, Texas, sat blistered and sun-bleached along the southern edge of the Edwards Plateau, the kind of town that had grown fast during the cattle boom years and now wore its prosperity like a man wears a borrowed coat, a little too proud of it, a little too aware it might be taken back. The main street was a long stretch of packed earth that turned to rust-colored mud whenever the rains came down hard off the plateau, and on either side of it stood the usual collection of wooden storefronts, a livery stable that smelled of hay and horse sweat, a saloon with a cracked mirror behind the bar, and a dry goods store whose owner, a heavy-set man named Elmer Potts, kept the most current news circulating alongside bolts of calico and barrels of flour. It was Elmer Potts who had posted the notice 3 weeks prior, tacking it to the board outside his store with the particular satisfaction of a man who considers himself the civic heartbeat of a community. The notice announced what the people of Harlow Creek had taken to calling, with varying degrees of delicacy, a bride auction. The official name, as printed on the notice in Potts's careful block letters, was a matrimonial arrangement and benefit auction, with proceeds from the entry fees going toward the repair of the town's only schoolhouse, whose roof had partially caved in during a winter ice storm, and whose remaining students were currently being educated under a canvas awning stretched between 2 oak trees. Jacob Sawyer had read that notice and done nothing for 2 weeks. He was 31 years old, a man of medium height but substantial build, with hands that told his history more plainly than any biography could. His palms were calloused from fence line work and cattle driving, his knuckles scarred from a half-remembered fight outside a Laredo stockyard 6 years back, and his fingers, though rough as bark, moved with a careful precision when he needed them to. He had a square jaw that he shaved every Sunday whether he was going to church or not, dark brown hair that he kept trimmed with his own pocket knife, and eyes the color of strong coffee, deep, warm, and fully awake even when the rest of him was exhausted. He owned a modest ranch called the Double Spoke, named for the 2 creeks that crossed his land in a shape that looked, if you squinted at a map, something like a wagon wheel spoke. He had 340 acres, a decent herd, 2 good horses, a dog named Calhoun, and no wife. He had not thought much about the wife problem, or he had thought about it in the way a man thinks about a tooth that does not quite hurt yet aware of it, occasionally pressing his tongue against it to check, but not ready to do anything drastic. He was not a lonely man in the obvious, desperate way. He had neighbors he respected, a foreman named Pete Dunbar, who was as close to a friend as Jacob allowed himself, and enough work on the ranch that most nights he fell asleep before his head had fully settled on the pillow. But then he had ridden into town on the morning of the auction because he needed a new length of rope and a sack of coffee beans, and he had found the whole main street transformed into something that felt half circus and half church social. Women in their best dresses stood clustered near the dry goods store. Men in varying states of clean leaned against the hitching posts, or stood with their thumbs in their belt loops trying to appear as though they had no particular interest in the proceedings. A small platform had been built at the north end of the street, 3 steps up from ground level, with a lectern and an oilcloth banner that said HARLOW Creek Schoolhouse Fund stretched between 2 poles. Jacob bought his rope and his coffee beans and then stood at the edge of the crowd because there was nowhere else comfortable to go, and that was when he first saw her. She came from the side of the dry goods store, walking in a way that suggested she had made a decision about this walk and was not going to let anything disturb that decision. She was dressed in a dark green dress that was neither fine nor shabby but fit her in a way that showed she had made or altered it herself, with care. She wore black gloves that reached her wrists and carried a small bundle of dried wildflowers in one hand, the flowers, a touch of something personal that felt at odds with the businesslike set of her shoulders. And over her face, secured beneath the brim of a plain black bonnet, she wore a veil. Not a wedding veil of white lace, but a fine dark mesh that draped from the bonnet's front brim to her collar, obscuring every feature of her face with a thoroughness that was unmistakably intentional. The crowd noticed her immediately. Jacob heard the murmur move through the assembled townspeople like a wave through wheat, a ripple of curiosity and surprise, and in some voices, an edge of something less charitable. He heard a woman near him say to her companion in a low, hard voice, "What is she hiding under that thing, I wonder?" And the companion replied with a small, mean laugh. Jacob did not laugh. He watched Cora Keller, for that was her name, though he did not know it yet, walk up the 3 steps to the platform with her spine perfectly straight, and her chin lifted at an angle that communicated, with remarkable clarity, that she did not care about the murmuring one bit, even though he suspected she cared a great deal and was simply refusing to let it show. He would learn later, from Pete Dunbar, who had learned it from Elmer Potts, who had learned it from the land office clerk, that Cora Keller was 26 years old, that she had come to Harlow Creek 8 months ago from a town 200 miles east called Salter's Crossing, and that she had been living on a small parcel of rented land at the east edge of town, where she kept a kitchen garden, and took in sewing work from the wives of the more prosperous ranchers. She had no family that anyone knew of in the area, no obvious protector, and no particular attachment to anyone in Harlow Creek. She had put herself in the auction voluntarily. That much Potts had confirmed, somewhat defensively, when asked. She had come to him herself, paid the entry fee herself, and had asked only one condition, which was that she be permitted to wear her veil throughout the proceedings. Potts had agreed because the schoolhouse roof needed fixing, and he was not in a position to be particular. The auction itself was conducted with the particular energy of a frontier social event that knows it is on the edge of propriety and has decided to lean into it anyway. There were 5 women who had entered, all of them presenting themselves on the platform in turn while Potts read out what he called their particulars: their ages, their known domestic skills, their general characters as he understood them from community acquaintance. The men in the crowd bid with hands raised or with called-out figures, and the whole thing had the casual, loud quality of a livestock auction, which was not lost on any of the women involved, though they bore it with varying degrees of stoicism. The first 4 women were bid upon with enthusiasm, and won by men who seemed, in varying degrees, genuinely hopeful about the outcomes. Then it was Cora Keller's turn. Potts cleared his throat. "Next we have Miss Cora Keller, age 26, a skilled seamstress and gardener, recently arrived to our community, of good moral character so far as is known." He paused, and Jacob could hear in the pause the weight of what was not being said about the veil, the mystery, the unknown quantity of what lay beneath that dark mesh. "She presents herself in the traditional manner," Potts continued, which was his diplomatic way of declining to address the veil directly, "and the opening bid is $5. The silence that followed was longer than it should have been. Jacob felt the silence differently than the rest of the crowd did. The crowd felt it as awkwardness, as the embarrassing gap that precedes a failed auction when nobody wants to bid. He felt it as something that called on him in a way he could not entirely explain, and did not try to. He looked at Cora Keller standing there on that platform in her veil, with her dried wildflowers held against her skirt and her chin still lifted, and he saw not mystery but dignity. He saw a woman who had come to a difficult place with her pride intact, and was now standing in a silence that would strip it from her if someone did not act. He raised his hand. $5, he said. A few heads turned. Someone at the back of the crowd said, $5.50. in the tone of a man making a casual bet more than a sincere offer, and Jacob looked at the back of the crowd for a moment and then looked back at Cora Keller on the platform. $10, he said. The voice in the back went quiet. Potts looked surprised, then rallied. $10, do I hear 11? $10 going once, going twice. I want to know what she looks like under that thing first, called out a man near the front. A thick-necked cattle hand named Bert Holloway, whom Jacob recognized as one of the riders from the Morrison spread. There was a chorus of agreement from several men nearby, and Potts shifted his weight behind the lectern with visible discomfort. "The lady has the right to her own presentation," Potts said, which was more diplomatic than Jacob expected from him. $10 is a lot of money for something you can't even see, Holloway pressed, and several people laughed, and Jacob saw Cora Keller's grip on her wildflowers tighten, the small bunch pressing against her palm, and something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. A bracing, a tightening, the physical expression of a person preparing to absorb a blow. "It doesn't matter," Jacob said. He said it loudly enough for the crowd to hear, in a voice that was not angry but very certain. He was looking at Holloway when he said it, and there was enough in his tone and in the steadiness of his gaze that Holloway looked away first. Then Jacob looked at Potts. $10 stands. Is there another bid? There was not. Potts's hammer came down, and the sound of it was like the period at the end of a sentence, and Jacob Sawyer and Cora Keller were, in the peculiar frontier custom of the matrimonial auction, committed to at least a meeting. An auction of this kind did not force immediate marriage. It was not quite that medieval, and Harlow Creek was not quite that removed from reason. What it arranged was a formal courting period of no less than 30 days, after which both parties were free to decline if they found the match unsuitable. The entry fee and the winning bid both went to the schoolhouse fund regardless of the outcome. Jacob walked to the platform as Cora descended the 3 steps, and they faced each other for the first time. He was near enough now that through the veil's dark mesh, he could see the suggestion of a face, large, serious eyes that were watching him with an expression that was not quite distrust, but was certainly not ease, and the shape of a mouth set in a careful line. "Jacob Sawyer," he said, and took his hat off. "I ranch out on the double-spoke road." "Cora Keller," she said. Her voice was low and even with a careful quality that told him she was measuring every word before she spent it. "I know who you are. You have a reputation for being reasonable. I hope that's a good thing." "It depends on whether it's true," she said. He almost smiled. "I expect you'll be the judge of that." She looked at him for a moment, and he held still under the look, not performing ease but genuinely feeling it, because there was something in her directness that made the usual social awkwardness of a situation like this feel unnecessary. "I have some conditions," she said. "I expected you might. I'll not be hurried." 30 days means 30 days and not an afternoon. "Agreed. I'll keep my own house and my own work throughout. I'm not a woman who needs to be kept." "I wouldn't have supposed you were." Another pause. Around them the crowd had partially dispersed, the auction concluded, people moving back to their business or gathering in the clusters that always form after a public event to compare opinions. A few people were watching Cora and Jacob with open curiosity, and at least one woman, the same one who had made the remark about what was being hidden, was watching with an expression that had graduated from mean amusement to something more calculating. "And the veil," Cora said. "I'll decide when or whether that comes off. It's not your concern until I make it your concern." Jacob considered this carefully, because it deserved careful consideration. He was not a frivolous man, and he recognized that this condition was the most significant one she had named, the one under which everything else would be negotiated. He could feel the curiosity in himself, the natural human pull to want to see what was hidden, and he examined that pull honestly for a moment, and then set it aside the way he would set aside an unnecessary tool. "That's your right," he said. "I meant what I said up there. It doesn't matter." She was quiet for a moment, and he had the impression that she was measuring not his words but the silence under them, listening for the note of insincerity that would tell her whether to believe him. He kept his expression open and let her listen. "All right, Mr. Sawyer," she said at last. 30 days. All right, Miss Keller." They shook hands, which was not the customary conclusion to such an arrangement but felt exactly right, and Cora Keller walked away down the main street with her wildflowers still in her hand and her veil still in place, and Jacob stood watching her go, and felt something he had not felt in a long time, something that was not quite excitement and not quite peace, but was some precise combination of the two that felt like the beginning of a thing. He went home to the Double Spoke and told Pete Dunbar what had happened, and Pete, a lean, sand-colored man of 42 who had been on the ranch since the year Jacob bought it and had strong opinions about cattle, weather, and almost nothing else, listened with his arms crossed and said, "A woman in a veil. Yes. And you don't know what she looks like?" "No." Pete was quiet for a moment. "Did she seem sensible?" "She seemed very sensible." Pete unfolded his arms and went back to the harness he had been repairing. "Well then," he said, which was his way of granting approval. The next day, Jacob rode into town with the genuine and only partially diplomatic purpose of returning a borrowed post-hole digger to the neighbor who lived on the road between his ranch and the town, and he stopped at the east edge of Harlow Creek, where a small wooden house sat back from the road, with a kitchen garden running along its south-facing wall. The garden was remarkable even in late April, more organized and more ambitious than most kitchen gardens Jacob had seen, with neat rows of early greens already up and the stakes for later planting set with careful spacing, and a small section along the fence that appeared to be purely flowers, not for food but for beauty. He knocked at the door and waited. There was a pause that was long enough to tell him she had seen him coming, which meant she had been watching from a window, which meant she was aware of him in a way she was not yet ready to admit. Then the door opened, and she was there without the veil, and Jacob Sawyer's heart did something complicated and immediate that he kept entirely off his face. Cora Keller's face bore a burn scar that ran from her left jaw upward in a wing-shaped pattern along her cheek, to the outer edge of her left eye. It was not fresh. It had the settled, smooth quality of a scar that had healed years before, the skin there permanently changed in texture and color, a deep rose pink against the warm brown of her unmarked skin. Her face was otherwise, and Jacob noted this honestly and without the word otherwise, because it was not an otherwise, it was simply the truth striking in a way that had nothing to do with convention. She had the large, serious eyes he had glimpsed through the veil, deep brown and direct, and strong, even features, and a quality of expression that was both intelligent and guarded, the look of someone who has learned to read a room very quickly because it has been necessary. She watched him absorb this, and her expression did not change, but she was very still, the way a person is still when they are waiting for the verdict. Jacob said, "Good morning, Miss Keller. I was returning a post-hole digger to the Hadley place and thought I'd stop and ask whether you'd care to ride out to the ranch this Saturday, so you can see what you'd be looking at if this arrangement were to go forward." She blinked. Just once, and just slightly, but he caught it. "You don't have anything to say," she said, and it was not quite a question. "About what?" She gestured briefly and without drama toward her left cheek. "No," he said. "Should I?" Another pause. She looked at him with a thoroughness that he bore patiently, and then she said, "Saturday is fine. What time?" "I'll come at 9 if that suits." "That suits." He put his hat back on and said good morning and went back to his horse and rode down the road without looking back, though he wanted to. And when he reached the main road, he allowed himself one long exhale and then set his horse to a trot and thought about everything except what he had just seen, because it was not yet something he had the right to think about. Saturday came with clear skies and the particular blue that Texas manages in late April before the heat has fully settled in for the season, a blue that looks polished rather than faded, and Jacob arrived at Cora's door at 9 o'clock with his two good horses, Rook. his own bay gelding, and a smaller roan mare he had borrowed from Pete named Maggie, who was the most reliably calm horse he owned, and an ideal choice for a woman whose level of riding experience he did not yet know. Cora came out wearing her green dress again with a light shawl against the morning air, and the veil in place over her face, and Jacob helped her up to Maggie's saddle without comment on either the veil or the riding, and they went out along the double-spoke road in the clear morning, with the spring grass showing green in the pastures and the live oaks putting out their new leaves. He showed her the ranch systematically, the house first, which was larger than she had perhaps expected, a two-story structure of local limestone with a good porch along the front and a kitchen large enough to work in comfortably. Then the barn, which was well kept and smelled of clean hay and horses. The pastures where the cattle were scattered in the middle distance. The two creeks that gave the ranch its name, both of them running with good spring water, their banks thick with cottonwoods in new leaf. She asked careful questions the whole time, the kind of questions that told him she was thinking practically about what a life here would look like. How many head of cattle? Who managed the day-to-day workings? Whether the limestone in the house kept it cool in summer? Whether the east garden ground got enough light? "There's no east garden," he said. "There's space for one," she said, and the way she said it was not a proposal, but it had the weight of one. They ate a midday meal that Jacob had prepared with more effort than he usually applied to cooking. A pot of beef stew made the day before and kept warm over a low fire, bread he had bought from the baker in town, dried apple pie from a tin he'd carried back from Laredo on his last supply run. He set the table in the kitchen and they sat across from each other, and for the first time since they had met, he was aware of a silence between them that was not comfortable and not hostile, but simply present, the silence of two people who are still finding the shape of each other. "I'll tell you about the scar," she said abruptly in the middle of the meal, setting down her spoon with a small, decisive sound, "because you're going to wonder and I'd rather it come from me." "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't." She folded her hands on the table. "I was 18. My family's house in Salters Crossing caught fire. I got out. My mother and father did not." She said this with a flatness that was not coldness but was the flatness of something that has been said many times, worn smooth by repetition. "I was the one who went back in to try to reach them. It was not something I regret. The fire reached me before I could get to them, and that is the whole of it." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your parents," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know you are." She picked her spoon back up. "After that I stayed in Salters Crossing for 5 years, living with an aunt who was not unkind but was not easy either. The town had formed a certain opinion of me, the way small towns will. The scar was something they could not get past, and after a while I found I did not want them to, because the getting past involved a kind of condescending bravery on their part that was worse than the staring." She paused. "I came here because I thought a new place might do. Harlow Creek is a bit better, but not entirely." "The veil," he said. "The veil," she confirmed. "I wear it in town because it is easier than the staring, and because some choices belong to me and not to anyone's opinion." She looked at him directly. "I don't wear it because I'm ashamed. I want to be clear about that." "I understood that from the first," he said. "The way you walked up to that platform." Something shifted in her expression, a softening so small and so quickly controlled that he might have missed it if he had not been paying close attention, and he was paying very close attention. "You noticed that," she said. "I noticed everything," he said simply, and then went back to his stew because he had said enough for now, and he could feel that she needed him to not press any further. They rode back to her house in the late afternoon in the kind of easy quiet that is entirely different from the tense quiet of before, and Jacob helped her down from Maggie at her front gate and stood with his hat in his hand for a moment. "Same time next Saturday," he said. She considered him. "Wednesday," she said. "Come Wednesday. I'll show you my garden." He agreed to Wednesday and rode home with the feeling of a man who has been invited somewhere that matters. Wednesday came, and then a second Saturday, and then a Wednesday after that. They established a rhythm of visits twice weekly, sometimes 3 times if some errand or other gave Jacob an excuse to ride into town in between. He was careful not to manufacture excuses too transparently, because she was observant enough to notice and proud enough to find it condescending. He came when he had genuine reason and stayed longer than the reason strictly required, and she did not point this out, which he took as encouragement. Her kitchen garden expanded during those weeks of spring with a rapidity that suggested she had been planning it all winter. She showed him the logic of her planting, which vegetables needed shade and which needed full sun, which plants she grew together because they helped each other, and which she kept apart because they competed, the whole thing organized with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything. He helped her drive new stakes along the east wall of the house where she was planting a row of climbing beans, and they worked side by side in the afternoon light, him hammering and her stringing twine between the stakes with quick, precise movements, and the domesticity of it was so natural and so comfortable that it took him by surprise. "I've done this before," she said, watching him set a stake with a level accuracy that most men would not bother with. "My mother had a garden," he said. "I helped when I was young and needed to earn something." "What did you need to earn?" "Permission to go hunting with my father," she laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it rearranged everything. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind, a full and unself-conscious sound that seemed to surprise her almost as much as it surprised him. She covered it with her hand quickly, as if catching it before it went too far, but the damage was done in the best possible way. Jacob Sawyer was now entirely lost, and he knew it with the calm certainty of a man who has stopped fighting a river's current and discovered that the water is warm. "I'll have to remember that," she said, recovering her composure. "Making children earn their pleasures through gardening seems very practical." "Very practical," he agreed, and neither of them commented on the fact that the hypothetical children in question might belong to both of them. But the word hung in the air of the garden with the mild sweetness of something blooming nearby. That evening, after he had eaten supper at her kitchen table, she had cooked a chicken stew with garden herbs that was the finest thing he had eaten in years, and he told her so without exaggeration. And after they had sat on her small porch as the light went down and talked about the town and the ranches and the weather patterns on the plateau, she took off the veil. She did it without preamble, without announcement, reaching up and unhooking the mesh from the bonnet's brim with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she did most things. She set it in her lap and looked at him with a directness that was almost confrontational, not in anger, but in the way of someone who is showing all their cards because they have decided to trust the game. He looked at her at the full, unobstructed reality of her face in the last warm light of the evening, the scar catching the last sun in a way that made it look, if you were inclined to see it that way, a little like a flame, which he thought privately was a strange and not unbeautiful irony given its origin. He looked at her large, serious, watchful eyes and her strong features and the set of her mouth, which he had been learning to read over these weeks and which was currently set in a line that was trying not to be anxious. "I've been wanting to tell you," he said, "since that first morning at your door that you have a remarkable face." She was very still. "Remarkable is a careful word," she said. "I used it on purpose," he said. "I don't use words I don't mean. Your face is remarkable. The scar is part of it. That's the honest truth, and I won't qualify it any other way." She looked at him for a long time, and the anxiety in her mouth softened degree by degree until what was there instead was something unguarded and honest and quietly deeply moved. She did not cry. He did not think she was a woman who cried easily, and he would later learn he was right about that. But something in her eyes was bright, and she turned her face toward the evening horizon for a moment as if checking something in the distance. "Jacob Sawyer," she said, "you are a very unusual man." "Is that a good thing?" She looked back at him, and she was nearly smiling. "It depends on whether it's true," she said, which was exactly what she had said to him on the day of the auction about his reputation for being reasonable, and the echo of it was deliberate, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. He rode home in the last of the evening light with his heart performing the kind of reckless internal choreography that he recognized from being 17 years old, which was the last time he had felt anything like this. And he rode past the turnoff to his own ranch, and almost to the Hadley place before he realized he had missed it, which had not happened to him since he was 17 either. In the second and third weeks of their arrangement, they found reasons to spend more time together than the formal courting structure really required. He rode with her to the mercantile in town and carried her packages. She came out to the Double Spoke on a Tuesday with no particular occasion and brought a jar of the herb vinegar she had been putting up, which Pete Dunbar later described as the finest thing he had ever tasted on a piece of bread, with the reverence of a man converting to a new religion. Jacob showed her the herd, riding alongside her in the wide pastures and explaining the cattle operation with a thoroughness that was part genuine pride in his work and part, he admitted to himself, wanting her to see the life he was offering in its best light. She saw it clearly. He had come to understand that Cora Keller saw most things clearly, which was both her defining quality and, he suspected, the thing that had made her life difficult in ways beyond the obvious. She was not a woman who would be satisfied with a half-truth or a flattering version. She wanted the actual picture. "The north pasture is overgrazed," she said one afternoon, riding along the fence line with him. "I know," he said, "I'm resting it this season. And the price of beef at the Laredo stockyard was down last fall." He looked at her with some surprise. "How do you know that?" "Mr. Potts talks," she said, "and I listen. The Greer Ranch had a bad autumn and the Morrison spread reduced their herd by a third. Both are signs of a difficult year." She paused. "I'm not asking for reassurance. I want to know if the ranch is sound." "It is," he said. "The north pasture will recover." The Laredo prices were down, but the San Antonio market held steady and I sold there instead. The herd is healthy and the books are current." He paused. "I can show you the books if you want." She looked at him with a quick, almost startled expression, and he understood that offering to show a woman his account books was not something she had expected or perhaps encountered before. "Yes," she said. "I would like to see them." He showed her the books that evening at the kitchen table, the ledgers he kept in his own precise handwriting, and she went through them with the focused attention of someone who has managed her own finances for years and knows what she is looking at. She asked 2 questions, both of which were excellent questions that he answered honestly, and at the end she closed the last ledger and said, "It's sound. I told you it was." "Yes," she said, "but now I've seen it myself, which is different." He could not argue with that. It was in the third week that the trouble with Harlow Creek's less charitable element introduced itself. Jacob was aware, through Pete and through general town talk that filtered back to him in pieces, that Cora's presence in the community and particularly her arrangement with Jacob had become something of a conversation topic, and not always a kind one. The woman he had identified on the day of the auction as the source of the mean remark. He had since learned her name was Hallie Morris, the wife of the town's only lawyer, seemed to have appointed herself the civic conscience on the matter of the veiled woman and her suitability as a rancher's wife. Jacob might have been able to ignore this in a more self-contained life, but Cora could not, because she lived in town and moved through it daily, and the remarks and the slights and the social climate of Hallie Morris's disapproval affected her practical life in ways that were real. 2 of the women who had been sending her sewing work stopped doing so, with excuses that were polite in language and transparent in motivation. The dry goods store, under Potts's management, remained neutral, but Potts was a man who needed to get along with everyone, and Cora had noticed a certain excessive cheerfulness in his dealings with her that told her he was compensating for something. She told Jacob about this on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting in his kitchen over coffee, with the veil hanging from the bonnet she had set on the chair beside her. She had taken to removing the veil inside his house with an ease that had developed gradually, and then suddenly, the way things do. I don't tell you this to make it your problem, she said. I tell you because you should know the situation you're in this town. I'm in the situation I chose, he said. Yes, and the situation includes Hallie Morris deciding that you've made a poor choice and that the town should agree with her. The town isn't required to agree with her. No, she said, but in a small place, silence reads as agreement unless someone contradicts it. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the surface of it. I've lived in small places long enough to know how it works. I'll talk to some people, he said. I don't need you to fight my battles, she said quickly. I know you don't, he said. I'm not fighting anything. I'm just going to be clear about where I stand, which is something I was planning to do anyway. She looked at him with the measuring look she still sometimes applied, checking for condescension, for the well-meaning paternalism that she had experienced from people who thought they were helping. He held the look steadily, and she found what she was looking for, or more accurately what she was checking for the absence of. All right, she said. What Jacob did was not dramatic, because he was not a dramatic man. He simply made it known around town, in the natural course of his business dealings and social contacts, that he was satisfied with his arrangement and expected to remain so, and that his opinion of Cora Keller was high, and he would consider it a service if anyone who disagreed would express their disagreement to him directly rather than sideways. He said this with the particular quiet authority of a man who is well regarded and not easily moved, and the effect was, not immediately but over the following week, noticeable. The sewing work did not fully return, because Hallie Morris had specific influence over the two women who had sent it, and they were more afraid of Hallie's opinion than they were moved by Jacob Sawyer's quiet endorsement. But the general temperature of Harlow Creek's attitude toward Cora shifted perceptibly, from the cool semi-hostility of a community protecting its idea of itself, to something closer to cautious neutrality, which in a frontier town was practically a warm welcome. More importantly, a woman named Della Frazier, who ran the boarding house and was the closest thing Harlow Creek had to a social conscience that was not also judgmental, sought Cora out one morning and introduced herself and said, in her straightforward way, that she needed a reliable seamstress and had heard Cora's work was excellent, and would she be interested in taking on the boarding house mending on a regular basis. The rate Della offered was better than the rate Cora had been getting from the ranch wives, and the relationship that developed from it, as Cora came to the boarding house twice weekly, was the beginning of the kind of community connection that Cora had not had since before the fire in Salter's Crossing, and Jacob could see what it meant to her even when she was careful not to show it too openly. He also noticed, with satisfaction, that Della Frazier was capable of being very forthright with Hallie Morris when the occasion arose, and that having Della in Cora's corner was worth considerably more than any number of quiet words from a rancher. The 30 days of the formal arrangement were drawing toward their end, and Jacob was aware of the calendar, with an attention he usually reserved for weather patterns and market days. He did not want to press, but he was also aware that 30 days, under the terms of the auction arrangement, was the period after which both parties were free to decline, and while he had no intention of declining anything, he was not yet certain what Cora intended, and her intentions were not something he was willing to assume. He invited her to the ranch on the 28th day, not to the house but to the south pasture, where he had been meaning to show her a particular view that the land offered in the late afternoon, when the sun came across the plateau from the west and lit the grass in a way that was as close to beautiful as a working ranch usually got. He had packed a supper in saddlebags, which required more effort than he was generally accustomed to applying to food preparation, but which felt appropriate to the occasion. He had spoken to no one about any of this, not even Pete, who would have said something dry and accurate that Jacob did not feel like hearing. They rode out in the long light, and he spread a blanket on the slope above the South Creek where the view opened up across the plateau, and they ate cold roast chicken and fresh bread, and a small crock of the sweet pickles she made from her kitchen garden cucumbers, and the sky went through its evening colors above them with the indifference and grandeur that Texas skies have, gold to orange to the deep burning red that fades to violet while you are still watching it. 2 days, she said, eventually. Yes, he said. She was sitting with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them, looking at the horizon, and the veil was in her dress pocket. He had noticed she had stopped wearing it outside the town proper altogether, at least when she was with him. The scar caught the evening light the same way it had caught it that first evening on her porch, that flame-shaped wing of changed skin, and he was so accustomed to it now that he saw it simply as part of her face in the way her eyes and her mouth were part of her face, integral and familiar. "I've been thinking about what I want," she said. "I expected you had." She turned to look at him. "I want to know what you want first," she said. "As a negotiating tactic. I want to know because you were honest with me from the start, and I want to hear it said plainly before I say anything." He looked at her directly. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want you to come to the Double Spoke and plant your garden and keep your independence and argue with me about the North Pasture, and show your face without the veil whenever you choose, and wear it whenever you choose. And I want to sit on the porch in the evenings and talk about whatever comes up. I want a life with you, Cora, and I mean that without any qualification or reservation." The evening was very quiet. A coyote called somewhere out on the plateau, and the sound of the creek came up from below the slope, and the last of the orange light was fading into violet overhead. "I want that too," she said, and the simplicity of it, after all the careful measuring and all the guarded watching, was so startling and so complete that he felt the back of his throat tighten in a way he was not going to acknowledge. "I want that very much," she said, and her voice was lower and she was looking at him with those large, direct eyes without any guard in them at all, and Jacob Sawyer reached across the blanket and took her hand. She looked down at their joined hands for a moment and then back up at him, and the expression on her face was the most unprotected thing he had ever seen from her, open and real and quietly luminous, and he thought he had never wanted to say anything more carefully in his life than what he said next. "Then it's settled," he said, and the warmth in his voice made the simple words carry everything that needed to be said. She squeezed his hand once, firmly, the same way she had shaken his hand on the day of the auction, that practical, direct pressure. And then she let out a breath that seemed to carry a great deal of weight with it, and turned back to the horizon, and they sat together in the violet evening while the stars began to come out over the plateau, and he did not let go of her hand, and she did not let go of his. They were married 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in early June 1874, in the small community church at the east end of Harlow Creek's Main Street, by the Reverend Thomas Ault, who had a pleasant face and the good sense to keep the ceremony simple and sincere. Cora wore a dress she had made herself from ivory cotton, not white, which she had decided was too much of a performance, but a warm cream that suited her coloring, and was finished with such care and such precision that Della Frazier, sitting in the third pew, leaned over to the woman beside her and said quietly that it was the finest piece of work she had ever seen from a seamstress, which was saying something given that Della Frazier had seen a great deal of fine work. Cora did not wear the veil. She walked into that church with her face entirely bare, the scar in plain sight in the June morning light, and her chin lifted at that angle Jacob had first seen on the auction platform. And there was a collective settling in the congregation that was not quite silence, but was the sound of a room adjusting itself to something that had decided to be exactly as it was. Hallie Morris was not present, having found a prior obligation on the same day that was entirely convincing to no one. Most of the rest of the town was there, because Jacob was well regarded, and because people in small places attend weddings out of community instinct as much as affection, and because Cora Keller had, in 6 weeks of being present in the community with her work and her directness and her uncompromising honesty, earned a certain respect that was different from and better than acceptance. Pete Dunbar stood beside Jacob as his witness, and wore the same leather vest he wore to all formal occasions, which he had been wearing since at least 1868, and which had achieved a character of its own. He shook Jacob's hand before the ceremony with a grip that said everything he was not going to say aloud about what this meant, and Jacob accepted it accordingly. Della Frazier stood beside Cora, because they had become genuine friends in the 6 weeks since their first conversation, the kind of friendship that develops quickly between women who have both had to manage difficult situations without much help, and who recognize in each other the specific competence that requires. She handed Cora a small bunch of fresh wildflowers before the ceremony, not dried ones this time, but fresh-cut late spring flowers from the meadow behind the boarding house, blue and yellow and pale lavender, and Cora held them the way she had held the dried flowers on the auction platform, pressed against her skirt, but with a different quality this time, not the bracing of someone preparing for a blow, but the holding of something good. The Reverend Alt asked the questions and they answered them, and when it came to the part where Jacob was asked whether he took Cora Keller as his wife, he said, "I do," in a voice that carried to the back of the church without being loud, the voice of a man who means what he says and does not feel the need to perform the meaning. And when Cora said, "I do," in her low, even voice, there was a quality in those 2 words that made them sound less like a formula and more like the conclusion of a long and careful process, which was exactly what they were. He kissed her for the first time there in front of the church and the Reverend and the assembled citizenry of Harlow Creek, which was not the first place he would have chosen for a first kiss, being a private man by nature. But there was something right about the openness of it, about doing this particular thing in front of the people who had watched her stand veiled on a platform and whispered about what was hidden, because what was there was this. A woman who had survived a fire and its losses and its aftermath with her honesty and her dignity intact, standing in June sunshine in a dress she had made herself, being kissed by a man who had bid $10 without seeing her face and had meant it when he said it did not matter. They drove back to the double spoke in Jacob's wagon with Cora's belongings from the house at the east edge of town, her sewing things, her kitchen implements, her garden tools, her books, 2 trunks of clothes and household linens, all loaded in the wagon bed and covered with a canvas against the dust. Pete had gone ahead on horseback, ostensibly to check on the cattle, but actually, Jacob suspected, to ensure the house was in the presentable condition he had spent the previous 3 days achieving. The house was indeed in excellent condition. Pete had swept every floor and laid a fire ready to light in the kitchen and put fresh water in the pitcher on the kitchen table. And then he had gone very thoroughly back to the barn, where he would remain until the next morning with the thoroughness of a man who understands the nature of occasions. Cora walked through the double-spoke house for the second time. The first had been on that initial Saturday visit, with the different eyes of a person who now belongs to a place, noting things with a proprietorial attention that showed itself in small ways. She stopped in the kitchen and turned slowly, cataloging it. She walked upstairs and stood in each room for a moment. She came back down and stood on the front porch and looked out at the pastures and the creeks and the plateau spreading west under the June sky. "The east garden," she said. "You can start it whenever you want," he said. "Monday," she said. He laughed, and she turned to look at him with a smile that was the fully deployed version of the near smiles he had been collecting for 6 weeks, wide and genuine and slightly wicked at the edges. And he thought with a clarity that required no examination at all that he was the luckiest man on the Edwards Plateau, and possibly a larger area than that. The summer of 1874 settled over the double spoke with a fullness that Jacob had not known the ranch possessed before. It was not that the ranch had been empty. He had been there, and Pete had been there, and Calhoun the dog had been there, and the cattle had been there. But there is a difference between occupancy and inhabitation, between a house that is lived in and a house that is being lived in well, and the double spoke became the latter with a thoroughness that surprised even Jacob, who had expected things to change but had not entirely anticipated the degree. The East Garden went in on the Monday after the wedding, and by midsummer had achieved a productivity that made Pete Dunbar revise his opinion of kitchen gardens from a thing women kept for flavor to a genuine agricultural enterprise. There were tomatoes and beans and squash and 3 kinds of peppers, and a small plot of cotton that Cora grew not for the cotton itself, but for the seeds she wanted to experiment with. And along the fence, the flowers, sunflowers and cosmos and black-eyed Susans, and a climbing rose she had sent away for by letter after seeing a catalog at the dry goods store, which arrived as a small bare-root bundle, and which she planted against the east wall of the house with instructions that it would bloom in its 2nd year. She kept her sewing work, which was important to her in a way that had to do with independence and identity, and not with financial necessity, and Della Frazier's boarding house remained her primary contract, supplemented now by several of the ranch wives who had, in the reconfigured social climate following the wedding, decided that their original assessment of the situation had been premature. Hallie Morris did not come around, which was a state of affairs that suited everyone, and her husband the lawyer was quietly embarrassed about the entire matter and expressed it by being scrupulously polite to Jacob every time they met, which Jacob accepted with the same equanimity he applied to most things. On a Tuesday evening in late August, they were sitting on the porch in the particular relief that comes after a hot day when the air begins to cool, and the cattle sounds drift up from the pasture, and the first stars are coming out. And Jacob was reading a letter from the Laredo stockyard about autumn prices, and Cora was doing fine work on a piece of white lawn that would become some part of someone's Sunday dress. And Calhoun the dog was asleep against the porch step with the total commitment to sleep that only dogs and the very young can manage, and Cora set down her sewing and said, "I think I might be pregnant." Jacob folded his letter with care and set it on the porch railing and looked at her. "How certain are you?" he said. "Fairly certain," she said, in the measured tone that meant she had been thinking about this for some time and had arrived at a conclusion she was now presenting. "Della says she knows a woman in Harlow Creek who midwives, a Mrs. Aragon, and she says she is very capable. Do you want me to ride in and arrange it?" he said. "No," she said. "I'll go myself on Thursday when I go in for the boarding house work. I just wanted to tell you." She paused. "I wanted to tell you first." "I'm glad you told me first," he said. She looked at him with the quiet attention she had been giving him all summer, which was different from the measuring look of the early weeks and had become instead something more intimate, a looking at rather than a looking for, and she said, "You're not going to make a speech about it." "I'm very happy," he said. "That's the whole speech." She picked her sewing back up. "Good," she said, and he could see that she was pleased in a way she was not going to make a speech about either, and the evening continued in its easy manner around the comfortable fact of this new thing. Mrs. Aragon, as it turned out, was an excellent midwife, a small, precise woman in her 50s whose family had been in Texas since before it was Texas, and who had the calm authority of someone who has attended births in every variety of circumstance and finds most things manageable. She confirmed the pregnancy in September, estimated February as the likely arrival, and gave Cora a list of sensible instructions that Cora followed with the same systematic attention she applied to everything. Jacob did not fuss. This was one of the things Cora had come to value most about him in the months of their marriage, his capacity to care deeply about something without turning that care into anxiety that had to be managed by someone else. He checked on her in the mornings with a directness that was never intrusive and helped with the heavier garden work as the season required, and let her continue to ride to town when she wanted and did not hover. When she was tired in the evenings, as she increasingly was in the autumn months, he was simply there, sitting on the same porch with the dog at their feet and the night sounds of the plateau around them, reading or mending harness leather, or doing nothing at all with the complete contentment of a man who has found the place he belongs. In the autumn there were cattle drives to manage. the herd sorted, and the steers taken to the San Antonio market, which required Jacob to be away for 10 days in October, something he had warned her about when they first discussed the ranch, and which she accepted as a matter of business practicality while also, he suspected, missing him in a way she would describe as the house being too quiet and nothing to do with sentiment. He was back in 11 days, not 10, because he had pushed the return as much as the trail would permit, and when he rode in on the afternoon of the 11th day, she came out to the barn to meet him, which she had not done on any previous occasion, and helped him with Rook's saddle with the efficient manner of someone performing a task rather than making a gesture. And when the horse was settled, she stood beside him in the barn doorway in the October afternoon light with her arms wrapped around herself against the autumn chill. She was showing noticeably now, her body announcing the pregnancy with the particular authority of a third trimester, and said, "The house was too quiet." "Mine too," he said, and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him with the ease of long habit even though they had only been married 4 months, the ease of two people who have fit themselves together in the way of a thing that belongs together. He brought her a gift from San Antonio, a small book of botanical drawings, plants of the Texas Plateau, that he had found in a stationer's shop near the Stockyard Plaza and recognized immediately as something she would love. She turned through the pages at the kitchen table that evening with an expression of absorbed pleasure that he stored away in the particular internal catalog he had been keeping all year of her expressions, which was his most valued private possession. The winter came hard to the plateau, as it sometimes did a December ice storm that glazed the pastures and brought a dangerous cold that cost Jacob 3 steers from exposure despite every precaution, and then eased into a January of pale sun and cold nights, and the particular crystalline beauty of frozen grass. Cora slowed her garden work as the ground required, spending more time indoors at her sewing, and the house was full of the smell of good food and wood smoke, and the occasional scent of lavender from the sachet she kept in her sewing basket. On the 14th of February, a date that struck Jacob as improbably appropriate, though he said nothing about it because it would have sounded like sentiment and he was managing his sentiments. Cora went into labor in the early morning and Mrs. Aragon was fetched from town by Pete riding hard in the pre-dawn cold, and by mid-morning the double spoke had a new inhabitant. It was a boy. A good-sized, healthy, loud-voiced boy who arrived, according to Mrs. Aragon, in a thoroughly straightforward manner, and announced himself with an energy that suggested he had opinions and was not going to keep them to himself. Jacob held him in the kitchen while Mrs. Aragon attended to Cora and felt the weight of him. This compact, red-faced, absolutely furious small person, with a sense of responsibility and wonder so large that it seemed to require more internal space than he possessed, and was spilling out somewhere he could not quite locate. He brought the boy in to Cora when she was settled, and she received him with the exhausted and radiant quality of a woman who has done a very hard thing and knows it was worth it. She looked at the baby for a long time without speaking, the same thorough attention she had given to everything that mattered to her, and then she looked up at Jacob. "Henry," she said. "Henry," he said. "My father's name," she said. "Henry Sawyer," he said, testing it. "That's a good name." She looked down at the baby again. "He has your nose," she said. "He has my nose and your stubbornness," Jacob said, "which is an excellent combination." She laughed, and then made a sound that was not quite a wince, but indicated that laughing was perhaps not the wisest activity at the present moment. And Jacob took Henry back from her, and sat in the chair beside the bed, and held his son while his wife slept. And outside the window the February sun came across the plateau, and lay itself across the floor of the bedroom in a long pale rectangle, and Calhoun appeared in the doorway, investigated the situation with professional thoroughness, and settled himself across the threshold, as though he had been appointed to the position. Henry Sawyer grew through that spring and summer with the determination of a living thing that intends to make its presence felt in the world. He was a solid baby, and then a solid infant, inclined to observe everything with the large dark eyes he had gotten from his mother and the steady unhurried attention he had gotten from his father, and then to reach for it or yell about it depending on whether the reaching worked. Cora handled the mothering with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything, consulting Mrs. Aragon regularly, reading the one book on infant care that the Harlow Creek Lending Library possessed, and applying a combination of instinct and research that produced a child who was healthy and alert, and by general community assessment, quite good-natured for his level of opinions. The East Garden's climbing rose bloomed that second summer exactly as the catalog had promised it would, putting out a long succession of small pink blooms along the east wall of the double-spoke house. And Jacob came around the house one morning and found Cora standing in front of it with Henry on her hip and her hand against one of the blooms. And the look on her face was the look of a person receiving something they have waited a long time for. He had learned so many of her expressions by now. The focused look of deep concentration over her sewing, the sharp, bright look she got when she was making an argument she was confident about, the soft, unguarded look she wore in the evenings when Henry was asleep and they sat together on the porch and she set down whatever she was doing and just sat, completely present and at ease in a way she was nowhere else. The look she gave him when she was about to say something that mattered, that barely perceptible steadying, the small gathering of herself before the directness. He loved all of them. He had told her so on a winter night when Henry was 4 months old and they were sitting by the kitchen fire, and she had asked him, with a characteristic directness, what he thought of her, and he had told her in the most honest and specific way he knew how, which meant it took some time and covered a range of things from her intelligence to her garden, to the particular way she moved when she was walking with purpose to the expressions he catalogued, and the sound of her laugh, and the extraordinary quality of her character, which he described as the finest he had encountered in any person, and meant without qualification. She had listened to all of this without interrupting, which was not her usual approach to conversation, and when he was done she said, "Jacob," in a voice he had not heard before, lower and more stripped of its careful quality than usual. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. "I didn't know if I was going to say it first, but there it is." He had crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and kissed her with a thoroughness that required no words to supplement, and Henry had been asleep in the cradle in the corner, and the fire had been warm, and the winter had been outside where it belonged, and the whole of that night was one he returned to regularly as a private landmark, a before and after in a life that had already had several of those but none quite so good. Spring of 1875 brought a prosperous cattle season and a new section of fence along the north pasture that Jacob and Pete and a hired hand named Louis Reyes, a young man from a ranching family south of Laredo who had come looking for work in the spring and proved himself worth keeping, built over the course of 2 weeks with the quiet satisfaction of men doing solid work in good weather. The north pasture, rested through the previous year as Jacob had promised, was showing the rich grass that said it had recovered well, and he expanded the herd with the purchase of 20 additional breeding cows from a rancher near Fredericksburg who was downsizing, bringing the double spokes' future prospects to the strongest they had been since Jacob bought the land. Cora's sewing work had by this point achieved a reputation that extended beyond Harlow Creek. A woman in the county seat town of Hartwell, 40 miles north, had seen a dress Cora had made for Della Frazier when Della attended a county social event, and had inquired about commissions, and then told her sister, and then told a friend, and by the early summer of 1875, Cora had more commissions than she could comfortably manage alongside mothering Henry and keeping the garden and the house. She discussed this with Jacob one evening with the pragmatic efficiency of a business problem. "I need either fewer commissions or more hours," she said. "I can't make more hours, so I need to decide which commissions to keep." "Or," he said, You could hire a girl to help with the housework and keep all the commissions. She considered this. That seems extravagant. It's a business investment, he said. If the commissions produce more income than the cost of the help, it's not extravagant. It's sensible. She looked at him with the sharp, bright look of someone appreciating a good argument. You're very convenient when I want someone to agree with the thing I already want to do, she said. I try to be useful, he said. They hired a girl named Maddie, the 14-year-old daughter of the Ray's family who had come up from south of Laredo, old enough for household work and eager for the wage. And with Cora's direction, she took over the heavier cleaning and the laundry and enough of the kitchen work that Cora had the hours she needed. Maddie turned out also to have a gift for managing Henry, who by this point was walking and vocal and thoroughly committed to the project of exploring everything that could conceivably be explored. And the two of them could be found on most afternoons in the garden or the barnyard, with Henry investigating the world and Maddie following at a careful distance to prevent catastrophe. The summer of 1875 was the summer that Harlow Creek's remaining awkwardness about Cora Keller Sawyer resolved itself, or more accurately was resolved, by a single event that had nothing to do with social opinion and everything to do with the kind of genuine necessity that cuts through convention with the efficiency of a good blade. A fire broke out in the boarding house on an August afternoon, a kitchen fire that started from a grease flare and moved faster than kitchen fires usually do, because Della's kitchen had been newly fitted with pine shelving that went up like tinder. It was caught quickly enough that the structure was saved, but the kitchen and the back room were badly damaged, and the boarding house was, for practical purposes, not functional until repairs were made. Della Frazier, who was a capable woman in most circumstances, found herself managing the immediate crisis of displaced boarders and damage assessment and insurance negotiations with the county insurance agent in a way that occupied her entirely. Cora, upon hearing the news from Louis Ray's, who had ridden in for supplies and come back with the town's conversation in addition, organized the double spokes response with the calm efficiency of a general who has seen disruption before and knows how to work around it. She sent Louis back to town with an invitation to Della to bring whatever boarders needed accommodating out to the double spoke, where they could use the upstairs rooms and the spare bedroom until the boarding house was repaired. She made this decision before consulting Jacob and told him about it when he came in from the pasture. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "How many boarders?" "4, currently." Della says 2 are long-term residents and 2 are passing through. "We have the room," he said. "Good thinking." She gave him a look that was half amused and half something warmer. "You can say if you'd rather not," she said. "I'd rather have Della's people comfortable than leave them without a roof," he said. "And I'd rather you did things like this without waiting to ask me." "I don't wait to ask you unless I think you might reasonably object," she said. "When have I ever reasonably objected to anything you've decided?" She thought about this with genuine attention. "The price you paid for that sorrel gelding last April," she said. "That was a conversation, not an objection," he said. "You objected." "I expressed concern," she smiled. "I think I may have been right about the price." "The horse is excellent," he said, "and you were right about the price, and those 2 facts are somewhat inconvenient to manage simultaneously." She laughed that full, real laugh that still, after more than a year of marriage, had the same effect on him as it had had in her kitchen garden, and went to make arrangements for the guests. The 4 boarders at the double spoke for the 3 weeks it took to repair Della's kitchen were a cattle broker named Ashworth, who was polite and very quiet, a schoolteacher named Miss Vance, who had just been hired for the rebuilt Harlow Creek schoolhouse and was waiting for her permanent lodgings to become available, and the 2 long-term residents, a retired Asier named Hooper and his wife, who were the kind of older couple who had been married so long they functioned as a single entity and expressed opinions in the same voice, which was dry and observational and, Jacob discovered, extremely funny. The 3 weeks were, unexpectedly, one of the most sociable and lively stretches the double spoke had known. Cora managed the household expansion with a capability that even Ashworth, who was not a demonstrative man, commented upon to Jacob during a post-supper smoke on the porch. "Your wife runs this place like a brigade," he said, with genuine admiration. "My own outfit in Kansas City could use that kind of order." "She could organize a cattle drive if she put her mind to it," Jacob said, which was not an exaggeration. "She probably could," Ashworth said, "and the food is extraordinary." The food was extraordinary. Cora had expanded her kitchen capabilities over the course of her marriage in the way of a person who applies intelligence and genuine interest to a new skill. And with 4 extra mouths to feed, she had simply scaled up, turning out meals that would not have been out of place in a much more established household. Miss Vance, the school teacher, offered to help in the kitchen one evening after supper with a shyness that suggested she was not sure of the offer's welcome, and Cora took her up on it with the warmth she extended to women who were clearly in new situations and finding their footing. And the two of them developed over the 3 weeks a friendship of the direct and practical kind that Cora formed with women she found genuinely interesting. When the boarders returned to Della's repaired establishment, there was a shift in the way Harlow Creek's community regarded the double spoke and the Sawyers that was subtle but real. Ashworth had connections and he talked. Miss Vance had taken up her position at the schoolhouse, which the Harlow Creek community regarded with the proprietorial pride of the fund that had paid for its roof. And she spoke of the Sawyers with the particular warmth of someone who has been genuinely helped by a family and intends to say so. Even old Hooper and his wife, who spent most of their time at Della's, were occasionally seen at the dry goods store telling the story of Cora's management of the household emergency, with the approving detail of people narrating a legend. Hallie Morris, at some point that autumn, took the occasion of Jacob's presence in Elmer Potts's store one Saturday to produce a somewhat strained civility that Jacob received with the same equanimity he gave everything, and Cora, when he reported it at supper, received with a dry expression and a comment that she had no particular interest in Hallie Morris's civility, but could recognize a social surrender when it was offered and would accept it as such. "That's magnanimous of you," Jacob said. "It's practical," she said. "I live in this town. It's better to have neutral relationships than hostile ones. And you don't care about being right," she considered this. "I was right before she was civil and I'll be right after," she said. "Her opinion doesn't change that." He raised his coffee cup toward her in a small salute, which was the kind of gesture she pretended not to find endearing and clearly did. Henry turned 2 that February, a milestone celebrated with a cake that Cora baked, and that Henry engaged with enthusiastically and face first, and with a small gathering of Della and Miss Vance and the Ray's family, who by this point were part of the Double Spoke's extended community in the way that good employees and good neighbors become. Louis Ray's had proven himself so capable over the past year that Jacob had made him second in command of the ranch operations, a position Pete Dunbar endorsed with the straightforward approval of a man who wants the work done right more than he wants credit for it. Pete himself turned 50 that spring, an event he refused to acknowledge, and which Jacob marked by presenting him with a new saddle of such quality that Pete sat in the barn for 20 minutes alone with it, in a way Jacob pretended not to notice. Life on the Double Spoke in the years following had the quality of something being built steadily, not dramatically, not without its difficulties, but with the purposeful momentum of people who know what they are doing and why. The herd grew. The ranch's reputation grew with it. Cora's sewing commissions were, by 1876, enough that she had taken on a second girl to help, not just with the house but with the simpler sewing work, a young woman named Grace who had nimble fingers and a willingness to learn, and who Cora taught with the patient, exacting manner of someone who had taught herself everything she knew and understood exactly how that process worked. There was a drought in the summer of 1876 that hit the Edwards Plateau hard. The creeks dropped to half their usual level, and the grass went brown in July, and the cattle had to be managed with a careful eye on water and feed, with Jacob riding the pastures daily and making the difficult decisions about herd reduction that a dry year sometimes required. He sold 30 head in August at prices that were not ideal, because the drought was regional and every rancher in the area was making similar calculations simultaneously, and he came home from the San Antonio market that trip quieter than usual. "Tell me," Cora said, when they were at the kitchen table after supper. He told her the numbers, clean and direct the way he always did with her, no flattering omissions. The sale had been lower than expected. The hay costs for the winter, if the drought continued, would be significant. The ranch was financially sound. The past 2 good years had produced sufficient reserve, but the cushion was thinner than he liked. She listened to all of it, and then she got up and went to the small desk in the parlor where she kept her own accounts and came back with her ledger and set it on the table. "My commissions this year," she said. "Here's what I have in reserve." He looked at the figures and looked up at her. "This is yours," he said, "for your work." "Ours," she said. "That's what marriage is, Jacob. When the pastures are good, you support the garden. When the pastures are thin, the garden supports them back." She sat down across from him. "The numbers work if we combine them. The ranch is fine." He looked at her for a long moment across the kitchen table in the lamplight of the summer evening and felt something that was too large and too settled to be called emotion, and was more like the sense of a foundation being tested and found sound. "Cora," he said. "Don't make a speech," she said, with the slight smile that was her shorthand for a great deal. "I was going to say thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. "Now let's work out the winter feeding plan, because I want to go to bed at a reasonable hour." They worked out the winter feeding plan, and the drought eased in September with a week of good rains that brought the creeks back and the grass starting to recover, and the winter was not as costly as the August calculations had suggested. The reserve held. The ranch came through the dry year in solid condition, and by the following spring it was expanding again. In early 1877, Cora was pregnant again, a development she announced with the same measured directness as the first time, sitting at the kitchen table, stating the facts, with the particular quality of contained pleasure she brought to things that mattered to her. Mrs. Aragon confirmed it in March. The expected arrival was September. This pregnancy was easier than the first in some ways and harder in others. The summer heat on the plateau was wearing, and she was not as young as she had been, though at 29 she was hardly old, and the energy of managing Henry, who was now a vigorous and thoroughly mobile 3-year-old, alongside everything else she did, was genuinely taxing. Jacob watched this without hovering and helped wherever she let him, and occasionally helped wherever she would have told him not to bother if he had asked, which was the particular advantage of simply doing things rather than asking. September arrived with the particular grace of Texas autumn, the heat breaking at last and the mornings cool. And on a Saturday, the 18th of September, 1877, Cora gave birth to a daughter. She was a smaller baby than Henry had been, with a full head of dark hair and her father's square jaw already visible in miniature in the determined set of her small chin, and she looked, upon arrival, as though she had already formed opinions about the world and was withholding them temporarily. Mrs. Aragon declared her excellent. Jacob held her in the kitchen as he had held Henry 3 years before, and the weight of her was different, lighter, more delicate, but the feeling it produced in his chest was the same enormous, overflowing thing. "Clara," Cora said when he brought the baby in. "After my mother. Clara Sawyer," he said. "It's a good name." "Clara me Sawyer," she said. "Me for your mother." He looked at her, this woman who continued, after 3 years of marriage, to surprise him with her capacity for thought and care, and said she would have liked that very much. Cora looked down at Clara with a look that was different from the way she had looked at Henry, not less, but different, the way each true thing is distinct from every other true thing. "She looks like she's planning something," she said. "She's your daughter," he said. "It would be surprising if she weren't." Henry met his sister the following morning with the ambivalent fascination of a 3-year-old confronting something that has displaced him as the smallest person in the house while also being, undeniably, interesting. He sat beside Cora on the bed and regarded Clara for a considerable time, and then announced that she was little, which was accurate, and that she was his, which was perhaps the most promising thing he could have said about the matter. The double spoke grew into itself over the years that followed with the steady accumulation of a life well lived. The East Garden, by its 5th year, had become a serious enterprise that provided not just the household's vegetable needs, but produced surplus that Cora sold through the dry goods store, and in one remarkable summer, shipped by rail to a grocer in San Antonio who had heard of her variety of sweet peppers through a neighbor. The climbing rose had covered the entire east wall of the house and was visible from the road, and in June, it was the most remarked-upon thing about the double spoke among travelers passing on the main road toward Laredo. Henry went to the Harlow Creek School in the autumn of 1880, walking into Miss Vance's classroom. She had stayed in Harlow Creek, married to the town's new doctor by 1878, but continued teaching because she wanted to with his father's solid confidence and his mother's observant eyes, and applied himself to his lessons with the systematic attention of someone who has been raised in a house where work is done properly or not at all. Clara followed 3 years later with the opinions she had clearly been formulating since September of 1877, and was noted by Miss Vance, now Mrs. Ellis, in a letter to Cora, as the most interesting student she had taught in 10 years, which Cora read at the kitchen table, and did not show Jacob immediately, but which he found later between the pages of her botanical book and read, with the private satisfaction of a man whose children are becoming exactly what he hoped they would. The veil had been folded and placed in the cedar chest in the upstairs bedroom for years. Cora kept it there not out of sentiment exactly, or not only out of sentiment, but because it was part of the story of her life, and she was not a woman who discarded parts of her story. She wore no veil now anywhere, not in town, not at community events, not at the county fair in Hartwell, where she won a ribbon for her pepper preserves in 1879, and another for her rose cultivation in 1881. Her face was as it was, and the people of Harlow Creek had long since arrived at the point of seeing it as simply Cora Sawyer's face, which was the face of a woman who ran a garden and a business and a household, and was married to Jacob Sawyer of the Double Spoke, and had 2 children, and was not someone you wanted to be on the wrong side of in a disagreement. On a Sunday evening in the autumn of 1881, 7 years after the matrimonial auction, Jacob and Cora sat on the porch of the Double Spoke as they had sat on every agreeable evening for those 7 years, with the plateau spreading away in the October light, and the cattle sounds drifting up from the pastures, and the live oaks at the South Creek catching the last of the color. Henry was inside doing his lessons with the particular reluctant concentration of an 8-year-old who has been told that the schoolwork comes before the evening. Clara was asleep, having retired early in the way of 4-year-olds who have been comprehensively busy all day, and then suddenly and completely run out of energy. Calhoun, who was elderly now and moved with the considered deliberateness of a dog who has long since established his authority and has nothing to prove, was in his accustomed place at the top of the porch step. "I've been thinking," Cora said. "Tell me," he said, "about the auction." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what I expected from it and what happened instead." "What did you expect?" She considered this with the thorough honesty she brought to self-examination. "Something practical," she said. "I was in a difficult position financially and socially. The auction was a practical option. I expected to meet a practical man who needed a capable wife and who would be reasonable enough that the arrangement could work." She paused. "I wore the veil because I did not expect to be bid on otherwise, and because I wanted to protect myself from the spectacle of it, from being rejected publicly in front of a crowd because of my face. He was listening. "And then you bid," she said. "And then you said it didn't matter, and I thought, well, I thought several things. I thought you might be lying. I thought you might be the kind of man who performs nobility. I thought you might be practical in a different way, not concerned with appearance because you needed a wife badly enough that appearance was negotiable." "What did you decide?" he said. "I decided to find out," she said. "And then I found out." She looked at him with the look that was not measuring anymore but fully and openly seeing, the look he had been on the receiving end of for 7 years, and that still caught him somewhere in the chest every time. "What I found was not what I expected at all. What I found was someone who meant exactly what he said, and who thought about things properly, and who was honest with me when it would have been easier to be kind instead, and who let me be myself without making it a gift I was supposed to be grateful for." She paused. "That's a remarkable thing, Jacob." "You told me I was a remarkable man once," he said. "On the porch in the evening the first time you took off the veil. I remember. You said it depended on whether it was true." "And then I found out," she said, with the near smile that had become the full smile that he loved more than almost anything. "What's your verdict?" he said. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, the same firm grip she had applied to the handshake on the day of the auction, the day he had bid without seeing and meant it when he said it did not matter. She held his hand with the certainty of someone who has no further questions on this particular subject. "It's true," she said. Above the plateau, the October stars were coming out one by one in the deep blue of the Texas evening, and from inside the house came the faint sound of Henry, abandoning his lessons in favor of a song he had learned at school and singing it with more enthusiasm than accuracy. And Clara made some small sound in her sleep from the direction of the children's room, and Calhoun shifted on the porch step and sighed the great sigh of very old dogs. And Jacob Sawyer held his wife's hand in the autumn dark, and felt the fullness of the life they had built together pressing against his chest from the inside like something that could not quite be contained by ordinary living, but managed it anyway, and was the better for it. The rose on the east wall had gone to its autumn quiet, the blooms finished for the season, waiting as it always waited for June to come around again, when it would open in its unhurried way along the old stone wall of the double-spoke house, pink and persistent and thoroughly at home. The way some things are, that were planted deliberately and tended carefully, and given the time they needed to become what they were always going to be. Jacob raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, quietly, without announcement, and she let him. And the night came down over the plateau with the thorough kindness of the sort of ending that is not an ending at all, but is simply the day's particular version of a very long and deeply good story still in the middle of being told.